Grimora.
The smell of fresh paint and new carpet was supposed to represent a fresh start. Mark had just closed on a flipped, split-level home in a quiet, heavily wooded Ohio suburb. The real estate investors had gutted the place entirely, replacing everything from the drywall to the HVAC system. The house was sterile, flawless, perfect in every way, except for the basement bathroom. For some inexplicable reason, the contracting crew had left a heavy antique wrought iron mirror bolted directly into the concrete wall above the sink. It was completely out of place against the modern subway tile. The glass was heavily clouded, deeply tarnished around the edges with black rot. Mark figured the heavy mounting bolts were just rusted tight, and the crew had gotten lazy at the end of the project. He made a mental note to tear it down over the weekend with a crowbar. But the house didn't feel empty. By the second night, Mark started noticing the cold spots. He would be walking through the newly renovated living room, and the temperature would drop 20 degrees in a single step. The air would grow thick, carrying a faint, suffocating scent of wet earth and copper. On Thursday night, a severe thunderstorm rolled through the valley, knocking out the power grid for the entire neighborhood. The house was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Mark grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed down the wooden stairs to the basement to check the breaker panel. The beam of his flashlight cut through the pitch black, sweeping past the open door of the basement bathroom. He paused. The beam had caught the antique mirror. Out of the corner of his eye, Mark thought he saw movement inside the glass, a subtle shifting of shadows that didn't match his own. He stepped slowly into the small windowless bathroom, shining the blinding white light directly at the glass. It was just his own reflection staring back, pale, exhausted, holding a heavy flashlight. But as Mark slowly lowered his arm to his side, his reflection didn't move. Mark froze. The air in the room instantly turned to ice. The man in the mirror stood perfectly still, his arm still raised, holding a flashlight that no longer shined. Slowly, the reflection's face began to contort. The corners of its mouth stretched upward into a sickening, unnatural smile, pulling the skin so tight it looked like the jawbone might snap through the flesh. Mark stumbled backward, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He blinked hard, silently begging his exhausted mind to stop playing tricks on him. But when he opened his eyes, the nightmare was real. The reflection was stepping closer to the surface. It raised two pale, bruised hands and pressed its palms flat against the inside of the glass. The clouded surface of the mirror began to ripple like standing water. Then the pounding started. The thing in the mirror began to strike the glass from the inside. It wasn't a muffled, distant sound. It was a deafening, violent crash that echoed off the concrete basement walls. Bang! 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 Spiderweb cracks began to fracture across the tarnished mirror. Mark turned to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. A crippling, freezing weight crashed down onto his chest, forcing the air out of his lungs. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold tile floor, dropping the flashlight. It rolled away, the beam illuminating the base of the sink. Paralyzed, suffocating, Mark could only watch as the glass finally shattered inward, not outward onto the floor, but inward like a vacuum being broken. A pale, emaciated hand reached out through the empty iron frame, gripping the wall. The entity dragged its twisted, broken body into the bathroom. It was dripping with a thick black sludge that smelled of rotten meat. Its joints cracked and popped loudly as it unfolded its elongated limbs onto the tile floor. It crawled toward him with terrifying speed, its head snapping erratically from side to side. It had no eyes, just hollow, rotting sockets, but Mark felt its gaze burning into his soul. As the entity loomed directly over his face, the creature opened its unnaturally wide mouth. It didn't scream, it inhaled. Mark felt a sudden, agonizing, tearing sensation behind his eyes. His memories, his warmth, his very consciousness were being violently ripped from his physical body, pulled into the dark void of the creature's throat. He felt himself falling backward into an endless, suffocating darkness. The last thing Mark saw before the darkness consumed him completely was the antique iron frame on the wall. Inside the restored, unbroken glass, trapped behind the tarnished surface, Mark watched his own face, screaming silently, while the thing wearing his skin slowly stood up, smoothed out his shirt, and walked calmly up the basement stairs.